24. Wood and wood accessories. Can't have American food without it. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the variety of ways the plentiful wood of the American forest was not only an important reason for the British colonization of North America, but was one of the main reasons for the survival of the British colonies. I'll also dive into how the North American forests shaped the development of American cuisine. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. Normally, I start from the colonial perspective here in the 17th century, and that is largely due to the fact that it was the rare person who was keeping a diary or chronicle or whatever and bothered to ask a Native American, any locals at all, what they thought about what was going on. However, this time, I have an uncredited speculation that the English colonists came to North America because they had cut down all their own trees. Whether this comment was real or not, it does touch on one of the definite reasons England was anxious to lay hands on the New World. As I've mentioned before, warfare was changing significantly in the 16th and 17th centuries, and one way was, thanks to better cannon, the shooting part was taking to the seas, and England, as an island nation, saw some virtue in that. In this dawning age of sail, wood and very specific types of wood were required to build the ships of war and trade that would set up England and later the British Empire to really feel its oats and come up with ditties like Rule Britannia. While the English Admiralty might have gone giddy at spotting the 100-foot-tall white pines in Canada and New England, the 17th century speculator, investor, merchant, and colonist had wider-ranging and often homelier concerns in their hearts. They were likely more focused on fuel and domestic wood products. All of the English colonists, whether in Jamestown, Plymouth, or even the later middle and southern colonies, came from situations where firewood, that is cooking fuel, and wood for daily life, buckets, trenchers, bowls, fence posts, bed frames, tables, handy sticks for pounding and poking things, and so on, were highly regulated. By the beginning of the 17th century, nearly all accessible wooded land in England and every last tree in urban Holland was owned by someone who had plans for that wood. Access to these woodlands was pretty tightly controlled, and cutting wood that wasn't yours was very punishable. Just one sign of the wood-poor nature of England was in the rogue charcoal burners that started to spring up during the most tumultuous years of the 17th century, whether during the Civil Wars or under one of the more disorganized kings. The regular warding of England's woodlands disappeared, and some of those same peasants that had been affected by the Enclosures Acts set up shop as rogue charcoal burners. This illegal charcoal would be sold below the rather high regulated prices, but would still be enough to keep a family outside the edges of entire starvation. Demand for charcoal was high since iron smelters, blacksmiths, potters, and other artisans required it, and maltsters, salt makers, distillers, apothecaries. Not to mention, many a striving middle class and gentry family preferred charcoal over wood for its smokeless heat. So all the English colonists were coming from a background where wood was scarce, wood skills were scarcer, and being confronted by more wood than they knew what to do with seemed the most impossible of all situations. But when they arrived on the shores of the New World, that is just what they found, more wood than they knew what to do with. Now the landscape was not just one huge impenetrable forest. Rather, much of it was pretty intentionally managed by native tribes using controlled burns. The understory fires controlled the growth of bushy understory plants and gave the forests a cathedral-like quality that had early explorers in awe as they were able to ride horses through what many termed the forest primeval. Portions of the forest that were kept clear of the understory were maintained that way as prime hunting lands that allowed for the grazing of deer and the collection of the nuts, fruits, and sap from a variety of hardwood trees. Open spaces near villages were also created for growing corn, beans, squash, melons, limited crops of tobacco, as well as encouraging berries, fruit trees, and particular herbs. So while the local tribes saw their woodlands as resources to be managed for a wide variety of intertwined uses over the long haul, the colonists saw pound signs. Bigger trees than just about any one of them had ever seen, and they were not owned by apparently anyone. In fact, the first industry that Jamestown took on, once it became clear that Virginian rivers of gold were an imagined folly, was sending home tall trees for masts and clapboard for fancy English houses. Some of the first products the Plymouth colony sent back to pay for their passage to the New World were the barrels they built to hold the fish they were processing. If we return to the Reverend Mr. Higginson's list for the Massachusetts Bay Colony that I included in the iron episodes, many of those tools were for woodworking. The Virginia Company, a group of investors seeking laborers to go and get the New World wood, had a similar list. To refresh your memory, those items included broadaxe, felling axe, steel handsaw, whipsaw, hammers, augers, chisels, gimlets, hatchets, froes, nails, and, of course, the grindstone. In the 1620s and even the 1630s, just as the earliest colonists were pretty terrible hunters, they were also pretty hopeless lumbermen and woodworkers. England was so wood poor that the skills of felling large trees were barely known, and the steps needed to process whole trees into clapboards for houses or shipbuilding, breaking down logs into barrel staves and shaping logs into large timbers for building things like mills had been largely lost. Most of these operations were done poorly or in very inefficient ways until colonists from areas that were still importing wood into England arrived on the scene. The archetypal log cabin of the frontier is based on designs brought by Swedish colonists in the middle of the 17th century, and the square-beamed cabins found all over Pennsylvania are typically based on German designs. The first water-powered sawmills were built by Germans, and the Dutch of New Netherland, now New York, brought their knowledge of wind-powered sawmills. So what were the trees these colonists found, and how were they using them? In the more northerly reaches of New England, evergreen trees, pines, spruces, firs, what are known as softwoods, were much more common. This was due both to the cooler climate and the fact that the fire management practices of further south were not practiced here. So the faster-growing conifers were able to outcompete the slower-growing hardwoods. That meant the tall, straight white pines, supple and springy, were available for shipmasts. By the end of the 16th century, England had used up all its own mast-type trees, and the Admiralty was forced to import mast pines and spruces from Scandinavia and the Baltic regions. This was a tricky proposition, since the 16th and 17th century was full of shifting alliances amongst the monarchs of those countries and the princes of Russia. Also, the trees were so short, the tallest masts often had to be spliced together from 2 or 3 trees, which caused its own problems. Softwoods are also resinous trees. That means they were exciting for the pitch, tar, and turpentine they produced, all essential naval stores, along with pine knots, which were great as light sources, and pine boards, which were favored for floors. Further south, warmer weather and the fire suppression of evergreens meant a wide variety of leafed deciduous or hardwood trees were available. Oaks were a favorite for a variety of reasons. The acorns were important food sources for pigs and colonists alike, and for the white-tailed deer for as long as they lasted. White oak made excellent barrels and boat timbers. Red oak was favored for barrels and fence rails, and black oak was particularly prized because it was resistant to the marine worms that bored into boat bottoms plying Caribbean waters. And oak bark was the favored tannin source for the tanning of cow and deer hides. White ash trees became the favored wood for the axe and other long tool handles. It had the right amount of flexibility and strength and could substitute for brass portions of some scientific instruments. Ash's combination of strength and flexibility led it to be the favored baseball bat wood in the 19th and 20th centuries. Poor hardwood forest management practices, global climate shifting, and pest invasions at the end of the last century have all resulted in ash losing its spot as both the favored bat and tool handle wood. American beech gained the nickname ironwood for both its strength and the toll working with it took on the softer iron and high carbon steel tools of the colonial era. But it did make excellent levers for presses, cranks, and anywhere weight was not an issue, and a particularly long-wearing and inflexible piece of wood was needed. Walnut was appreciated for its nuts, collected both green and ripe, pickled, roasted, and even made into ketchups. This heavy, dense-textured wood was used in furniture, as decorative accents, and it made particularly formidable doors. Maple was appreciated for its springy strength. It was a favorite in oars, both the boat and beer mash stirring types. It was liked for eating trenchers and food preparation items like bread troughs and bowls. It gave no off flavors to food and put up well with rough handling and tended not to crack if dropped. Native Americans tapped maples for their sap and rendered it for sugar. Western tribes also did this with alders, which don't cross the Mississippi. Birch trees didn't contribute much in the way of timber to colonial life, but they were useful in other ways. Like maples, they were trees tapped for their sweet sap. The fact that Russian, Scandinavian, and some German immigrants also had a history of tapping birch trees for sap and adapted their techniques to maple tapping led to much confusion over whether sugaring sap was a North American or a European practice. After much wrangling and study, it has been determined to be both. Beyond sugaring, birches were also used for their twigs, as whisks and a way to store dried yeast between brewing batches of beer. And birch bark, which can be harvested in large, flexible sheets, was used to make storage containers and canoes for moving among the many navigable waterways of the East Coast. Poplar could be shaved easily into thin veneer sheets. These were used to make fancy containers by urban crafters called white coopers. The light-colored, open-structured wood took colors easily, and so the oval and rectangular boxes were painted elaborately, highly polished, and displayed as prized possessions or exchanged as gifts. As a faster-growing hardwood, it is still a very popular veneer wood into the 21st century. Even today, you'll find lots of poplar veneer at IKEA. Hickory was another popular nut tree and was a favored firewood tree. It burned hot and long and bright. It was durable and not too heavy, so was also popular for furniture and as a framing wood for buildings. Cherry and apple trees were mostly grown for fruit and usually were not used for building, though both did make excellent decorative and smoking woods for smokehouses. Cherry wood polished to a striking glossy reddish color and became favored for furniture and decorative handles. Hazel or hazelnut was not so much known as a wood since it does not typically grow into impressive trees. Hazel thickets are more common, but it was and is very loved for the nuts. European confectionery doted on the relatively sweet, soft nuts. There are a couple of western hazels on my neighborhood walk, and I can always tell when the nuts are getting ripe. The thin tree boughs bounce with excited squirrels attacking the nuts. Chestnut was extremely popular as a nut tree, a firewood tree, and as a furniture tree. It definitely was a victim of its own popularity. Chestnut trees were spread all over the eastern seaboard as food sources by the local tribes. Large trees provided bushels of nuts each season, eaten roasted or ground into flour. Colonists saw the large trees and cut them down as a way to harvest a bounty of nuts and wood all at the same time, but apparently forgot to adequately husband new replacement trees. Later, the importation of chestnut blight would end the American chestnut for centuries. Even now, there is not a healthy population of American chestnuts. Locust wood was one of those things that appeared everywhere that undergrowth was not managed. It was disliked because it was a very hard wood. It dulled tools and was hard to make much with, except for pegs, or what was called tree nails, that were reasonable substitutes for expensive iron nails. The wood's hardness meant it would not split when pounded. Gum trees were another mostly pest tree, but the stumps would rot from the center out. That meant largely hollow logs could be charred and scraped out to make solid wood gum barrels. These were much less work, and they could be as watertight as the more traditional staved oak barrels that took far more equipment and expertise to build. Elm and holly trees both had European and American variants, so were familiar to the colonists. Neither were particularly commercially important, but both played aesthetic roles. Outside of the nice, dry, picturesque plains and mountainsides, swampy areas with plenty of ponds provided two other important tree types. Cedars, particularly in the swamps of New Jersey, were appreciated for their light but strong and flexible wood that was very rot resistant. Cedar was a favored wood for both the shakes and shingles of colonial and English homes and for the small boats of the whaling trade. And willows, their long, flexible boughs or withies, were indispensable as hoops for barrel cooperages where iron was scarce, and for weaving tight shelters for keeping rabbits and eventually chickens. The last tree on my list, but possibly the first tree to inspire New World arbor mania, was the sassafras tree. It's a bit tough to track down exactly how it started, but for the 17th century Europeans, sassafras had the dubious, overhyped powers of colloidal silver, alkaline water, essential oils, and magnetic necklaces all rolled into one. Much of this can be attributed to the lack of the scientific method in general, and the fact that sassafras does actually have some antimicrobial properties and did act as a mild stimulant and analgesic, or pain reliever. Oh, and it smells spicy and delicious. It was one of the original base flavors of root beer. The leaves were, and still are, useful in stews as a thickener and are nutritious. You'll find them today at the grocery store as filet powder if you ever cook gumbo. This combination of good taste, good smell, pep, and pain relief, even mildly, led sassafras to be prescribed to solve everything from malnutrition to aid in weight loss, infertility to birth control, cure for melancholy, and as a calmative for hyperactivity. It became the thing that could do something for everyone. Such expansive hype and popularity led to expeditions that would strip areas so thoroughly of large sassafras trees that even today they can only be found as bushy understory shrubs. There are some other intervening factors, but still. Sassafras is one of those things that worked well when it was considered rare and required individual effort to acquire. Judiciously applied as a local remedy for specific ailments, it likely did far more good than harm. But once it became fashionable and a way to make money, and was overprescribed for everything under the sun and otherwise, it became a bigger problem than a cure. So that's a roll call of the major trees that the colonists found, and more importantly, found commercial uses for. Not sure what all these different trees look like? Don't worry, I'll put up pictures of them in the show notes. In trees, as with every other commodity in the New World, making money and showing that you had was quite the thing for the 17th century Englishman. So if wood was so abundant in the New World, beyond superior craftsmanship, how was a prosperous landowner to distinguish himself if just everyone had access to plenty of wood? The answer? Import different wood, specifically mahogany. When I read about this, for some reason it just struck me as kind of the ultimate flex. Sure, there's plenty of wood for everyone and everything, but I will have a different sort of wood for decorative purposes only imported. It's not quite watering my lawn to keep it green during a mega drought level, but there are similarities. Aside from being sent back to the home country as masts, barrels, boards, and drugs, how did this apparently boundless, inexhaustible bounty get incorporated into colonial daily life? First, heat and cooking. All of a sudden, instead of meager bundles of expensive fuel, the colonists had access to piles of wood and standing dead trees they had just girdled in their own fields, just waiting to be cut down. The housing may have been crude to start with, but every family or third son seeking his fortune had access to fire. Instead of small kettles of food, grudgingly warmed at only the start and end of the day, as soon as fireplaces were built, American cooking fires were kept going all day. The grains and breads of home may have been in short supply, but cauldrons of succotash and pots of stewed fowl were now bubbling away all day and available to the colonist clearing his land and chasing his pigs in ways that were unknown to the English peasant. The second local use for wood was the building of structures. By the 17th century, there were almost no large trees available for the common people to build houses, and only landowners could build fences. But upon arrival in the New World, there were large trees and land for claiming. One of the first things built were palisades, or wood-walled fortresses for defending newly claimed land. Such structures went up both in Jamestown and at Plymouth soon after the establishment of each New World foothold. Despite all writings of just wanting to live as God intended, or claims that the land was not owned by any civilized man, the very fact that the colonists at Jamestown and Plymouth had the plans and the means for a military footing meant that at some level they knew they were invading someone else's land and taking it by force, regardless of how much they felt entitled to do so. Once the palisades went up, small rectangular clapboard cabins arose. Again, the sturdy log cabin would not appear until Swedish and German colonists appeared with their knowledge of dressing whole logs with the necessary corner joints and the tools for making said joints. They also brought wedges and mattocks that split planks much faster than the original whipsaws the English colonists brought. After houses were built, the problem of fences was next. Because there was apparently all the land anyone could want, the general solution was to fence gardens and fields and let stock run wild. If the neighbor's cow ate your pumpkins, well, it was your fault for not having a strong enough fence, not the fault of the cow owner for not containing the cow. This earliest interpretation of responsibility and law will color the development of American regulations and legal codes from then until the very present. Once the problems of warmth, food, and shelter were covered, it was time to make money. And to make money, goods had to be transported to people willing to buy them. So wood was also used to make containers to transport stuff and vehicles to transport said containers in. The cargo container that ruled the world at this point was the barrel. I'll go more into the how of barrels in the 18th century. But suffice it to say, barrels had been the everything of goods transport since approximately the late Roman Empire. They were flexible enough to withstand most of the rigors of wagon and boat transport, and the egg shape meant only a very small portion of the vessel was in contact with the ground at any time. So a barrel of hundreds of pounds could be turned and moved, that is, rolled, by a single human. They were reusable, cleanable, and repairable. They were the perfect cross between a shipping container and Tupperware that the world needed at the time. By the 17th century, oak was the king of barrel woods, and the New World had oaks everywhere. Oaks may have been everywhere, but roads were not. especially in the first half of the century. So the transport built in the 17th century colonies was more focused on water transport than land. Canoes, barges, and rowing boats on the rivers, and sailing vessels on the ocean were all made of American wood. And because the wood was apparently endless and free for the taking, and making money was the first order of the day, forests and the land they were on were seen as resources to be mined and plundered, not husbanded and tended. Thus, many of the earliest colonial wood products were typically crude, wasteful, and not particularly durable. Fences and barges were made crudely and in haste, and often had to be remade after a single use or season. The prevailing attitude was often, why waste time on money or craftsmanship? I'm in a hurry, and there's always more wood. Large trees that provided acorns or nuts for humans, livestock, and deer alike were chopped down because harvesting the nuts took time, and firewood and charcoal and ashes for soap were needed now. The water-powered sawmills producing planks and boards turned up to 40% of any log to waste, as opposed to hand methods which were closer to 20%. But the mills were so much faster and the wood so plentiful, losing almost half of a log to sawdust was seen as a reasonable cost. The mill owners swimming in sawdust simply dumped the waste downstream. This was possibly the first act of North American industrial pollution. For combined with colonial overfishing, the first colonists saw the disappearance of the bounty of freshwater fish that had seemingly overrun the waterways of North American streams just a few decades before. And as in areas trees were cut down, the streams were altered, and the deer moved on, many a newcomer saw the initial richness of their new land wane. So they simply picked up and moved on to the next likely-looking patch of land. For why not? No one else was farming it. This early sense that a forest, just being a forest, was land underused or even wasted has been with this country the moment John Smith and John Cabot stepped ashore and said, "For England." Even today, it is hard to explain to many an American that land that lacks human development isn't wasteland or doing nothing. But that sense of boundlessness, the need for haste and quantity over quality, and resource management were important elements of how America became what it is today. Looking back, poor decisions were made for the health and happiness of the future, but then as now, this is not something the colonial mindset was ever willing to consider. Always, the concerns of the immediate moment seem to take precedence over thoughts of a future that seems so very far away. One of the constant thoughts of the moment was food, and making food that would last and would possibly be tasty. Early on, that was definitely the order of importance. Pickling things, fruit, vegetables, fish, meat, you name it, was a favorite way to go. And with the development of barrels, not to mention the ability to fire pottery for jars, jugs, and pipkins, it was now possible not just to make pickles, but to store them, and in quantity. So next week, we'll look in detail at the different sorts of pickles that propped up British colonial cuisine. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference. Two good places to do this are at Apple Podcast and on Good Pods. And it does help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for this episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.